All right, everybody, welcome back to our second day of class here. And we ended class last time talking about the three questions that all societies must answer when it comes to the production of goods and services. So, how are we going to produce the goods and services? What are we going to produce in terms of what's the selection of goods and services? And for whom, right? What's the distribution going to be like for those particular goods and services that we're producing through the various methods of production that we choose. So there have been three main ways that economies have been organized over time. The first one, the oldest way, is called the traditional economy. So traditional economies are typically ag economies. And these are situations where things are done the same way they've always been done. There's little to no progress. This is the oldest economic system. It's still used today in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. The characteristic of a traditional economy is that occupations tend to stay in the family. So if your father was a cobbler and made shoes, you were a cobbler. If your parents were bakers, then you would be a baker. Now we see, there's certain elements of traditional economy to some of our lives out here, right? The occupation stays in the family. Your parents might be a rancher. You might be expected to be a rancher, right? So it's not as if the traditional economy is completely devoid from advanced markets, such as the United States. But the key part we're talking about here is that if the whole economy is organized as a traditional economy, there's little to no economic progress or development. One of the hallmarks of a traditional economy, which seems very quaint and desirable to us these days, but would actually be very limiting, right, is that you only consume what you produce. So you want butter, you have to churn it yourself. That kind of situation, right? So there's no Walmart, there's no Amazon to deliver things, right? You have to subsist through what you're producing and then the little bit of trading that you can do, a little bit of bartering that you can do with neighbors and other people that you can interface with, right? But traditional economies are also hallmarked with, terrible infrastructure, lack of communication, lack of transportation, so on and so forth. So traditional economy, how it started. One of the first major experiments that we had, that we are still having, with economic systems has to do with the method of organizing called a command economy. So the hallmark of a command economy has to do when economic decisions are passed down from a government authority. So the government makes the economic decisions, and the government owns all resources. So in a command economy, we're going to have the situation where the government decides that question of what goods and services are produced. How is that question of what goods and services are produced answered in the traditional economy? It was answered by you produced what your parents produced, right? The occupation stayed in the family. So there was a lot of inertia in the traditional system. compared to the command economy, which is much more versatile, much more, it can adjust on the fly, right? Because the government is saying, oh, you go to this factory, make shoes. Oh, you go to this place, bake bread, right? So in addition to deciding what goods and services are produced, the government is also going to decide how to produce the goods and services. So what do we mean by how? We're talking about what methods. So we're talking about what inputs, and essentially we're talking about what technologies are going to be involved in the production process of those goods and services. So the command economy is very flexible. The command economy can be very responsive. And one of the other, the probably silver lining of the command economy is the fact that, so since the government owns all resources and they decide what goods and services are produced, there isn't an issue of where do I work, right? In command economies, you're usually guaranteed a job. And then also in command economies, there's usually a lot of necessities. Like food, healthcare, education, clothing, even toys. For free. Now, this doesn't mean that you're getting all the clothes that you would be getting right now, right? I'm saying you would get like 3 pairs of clothes. I have a new friend that was raised in communist Albania, and they had like 2 books that were produced by the Office of Educational Materials. They didn't have to buy the books. They were given those books and those toys, but instead of getting, think of these kids in America with the 30, 50 presents every Christmas or whatever, right? And you had, people growing up with 2 books. So, yes, they're free, but it's also sparse, right? So that's a command economy. So we still have elements of command economies today, right? Some of the examples that we would have today would be Cuba, North Korea, and to a certain degree, China. Historically, how do you think those pyramids got made? It wasn't through volunteers, right? Ancient Egypt used a command economy. Medieval manor life was exemplified by a command economy, right? Where we had the lords and the knights and the peasants and the right, that whole situation, the gentry, the kings, the queens. And lastly, the one that I was talking about with Albania and the Soviet Union, communism. Not socialism, but communism. So communism is a separate form of organizing where the government owns all the resources and everybody gets paid the same amount of money, right? Everybody gets the same amount of books for their children or toys for their children. Socialism has to do with the government or the people owning all the means of production, but people still getting paid different amounts depending on their productivity to the environment, to the society. So communism is this command economy. Socialism is not the same thing as communism. Socialism is kind of a area in the middle between a command economy and this next part of economic organizing that we're going to talk about, which is going to be the market economy. Questions on command economy and examples of command economy. It's a very broad group, very broad situation here, but it has to do with those questions about what, how, and for whom, right? How do they answer the for whom question? They say, well, everybody gets 2 books. Everybody gets 3 pairs of clothes. Everybody gets a loaf of bread and a gallon of milk every week or whatever the case may be, right? Kind of a boring life if you think about it that way, right? There's no There's no change in the consumption patterns that you have. There's no heterogeneity in consumption, right? You don't get to have some preferences for something that is different than somebody else, right? We would all get the same exact video games. There would be many, many less video games. I don't even know if there would be video games at all, honestly. We'd probably still be, on tabletop games, right? Because capitalism and the market economy is what has incentivized the development of a lot of these technologies and a lot of these advancements. So let's get right to it. The belle of the ball, the worst, best system that we've found so far, the market economy. So in a market economy, the characteristics of a market economy is that economic decisions are decentralized. We have a situation where private individuals own resources and businesses supply goods and services based on demand, based on the willingness and availability of consumers to pay for them. So when we're talking about a market in the market economy, we're talking about any place where buyers and sellers come together. So Walmart's a market, Amazon is a market, so any combination of supply and demand. And when we're talking about market economies, we're oftentimes talking about private individuals or private enterprises, right? So an enterprise is just a company. So it's a group of people. And in a market economy, the individuals or the enterprise own those resources, those buildings, those factories, those coffee beans, the barista machine, the tables, the sign, everything, right? All the elements of a business, instead of being owned by the government and the command economy, are now owned by a private individual or a group of individuals known as an enterprise. So we don't have to really harp on the market economy too much, right? Because we live in one, right? We live in something that is mostly a market economy. Which leads me to my next point, which is that most economies in the real world are mixed. There's some elements of the command, the traditional, and the market in the United States, the Euro area, Latin America, pretty much the rest of the world, right? Japan. So the U.S. economy is positioned more towards the market-oriented end of the spectrum, while countries like Europe and Europe and Latin America are kind of in the middle. But all of them are mixed. And part of this has to do with the fact that there's no such thing as an absolutely free market. So in every situation, we have regulations that define the rules of the game. So these regulations that are supposed to level the playing field impede the market economy and shift it more towards the command economy. So economies that are market-oriented have fewer regulations. Why do they have these regulations? So ideally, they have just enough regulations to maintain that level playing field. Now, what happens if we have a situation where we have a heavily regulated economy? Well, heavily regulated economies tend to have underground economies or black markets. Which are markets where buyers and sellers interact without the government's knowledge. And then to make it even more complicated, in some of these countries, people will participate in an underground economy, not necessarily because it's legal, but because they don't want to pay taxes on it. This is called the informal economy. So the underground economy kind of splits into a black market, which is about illegal activities, and then it splits into an informal economy market, which isn't necessarily about illegal activities, but it's about people that are doing things and then not letting the government know because they're not paying taxes on it. So especially in Latin America, South American countries, African countries, right? The percentage of the informal economy as a percent of the whole economy is quite large. Here in the United States, you know, we're in the habit of paying our taxes. We're in the habit of most things being above board. But that's not the case throughout the rest of the world. And it creates all sorts of problems for governments to do their job, right? If you don't have enough money, you can't pay people, you can't enforce any of the regulations, you can't talk about any kind of disputes about the regulations, and you end up having a bad time, right? Questions on the different types of economic organization and how it relates to the real world. So command market and traditional. Most economies are mixed. There's no such thing as a free market. There's always going to be some sort of regulation rules of the game.